community, XebiaLabs, and SaltStack. We're going to be talking about how all of us have critical business challenges and goals that we have to meet. We need to ship software faster, and of course the challenge is how do we do that without breaking everything in the process. But we also have to ship faster in an environment where maybe we have manual or error-prone infrastructure in environments that we're working with. So how do we deal with that? Along with this more complex end-to-end process that we have to use of getting code from development and production. Essentially the DevOps challenge that we're going to be talking about today. We'll be looking at accelerating software cycles, how we deliver automation capabilities, and enable data-driven environments that provide continuous insight to the end-to-end software release. For our agenda today, a little bit of housekeeping that I would like to take care of. Then we're going to be talking about what to do DevOps. So what do I need to do now? If this is what I want to get involved in, how do I do this? Second topic is 3 pain points to address, and then different companies, different challenges. How SaltStack and XebiaLabs help across the spectrum. And we'll follow that up with some QA. So let's touch on our housekeeping. Now, this webinar is being recorded. We'll be providing links to the slides and the recording after the presentation. If you have any questions, please enter them in the questions section of the GoToWebinar window, and we'll be queuing those up, and provided we have as much time as we have available at the end of the webinar, we'll get in as many questions as we possibly can. Great, well, let's get on to our speakers. We have two very exciting speakers to talk with us today. Matt Meservey is from SaltStack. He is the Director of Product Management, and Andrew Phillips from XebiaLabs, VP of Products. So I'm going to turn over to these gentlemen to talk about the topics we discussed. Guys, take away.
Hi, my name's Matt. I'm the Director of Product Management for SaltStack, and I'm excited to be talking to you guys today about DevOps. It's something that SaltStack is very strong in, and we have a lot of knowledge to share, and we like to hear what customers are trying to do with it in order to continue to meet the market and to help people solve customer needs. So we're excited to talk to you guys today.
Same here. Yeah, it's Andrew. Thanks, Matt. Looking forward to this webinar. Absolutely. Thanks to everyone who's taken the time today to listen to us. And yeah, obviously it's a webinar, so the amount of interaction we can have will be restricted a bit to the Q&A at the end. But as Matt said, this is really a session where we're trying to learn, share experience and knowledge, but also understand what the challenges are that you're facing. And without further ado, let me talk about that a little bit later. But first, Matt will say a little bit about SaltStack.
So SaltStack, if some of you may know or some of you may not, is a cloud and infrastructure orchestration and automation tool. And really, we are an open source project. We have both an open source and an enterprise product. We started out as an open source project, and we are actually the world's second largest Python project. So just we have over 1,200 active contributors. We're just behind Android actually in the number of contributors. For point of reference, that's a little over twice as many contributors as Docker. What we do is we do infrastructure and cloud management, and we do it in a little bit of a different way. So we use a master minion architecture. We're massively parallel. We're very, very fast and scalable. And the interesting thing for the DevOps people is that we've taken sort of an opposite approach from traditional infrastructure, cloud, and DevOps tools in that we're not a reactive tool. We don't look at the state of the infrastructure, take a job, and then apply a job. We actually define systems management as a data structure. So you use Python and YAML files to create a data structure to define what your infrastructure looks like. You can then just send that infrastructure definition out, and the minions or the agents on each individual box will do the things necessary to bring themselves in compliance with that state. So what that means for a DevOps team is that they can go in and write an application, and they can define what the infrastructure is supposed to look like, either an infrastructure that's temporary for testing. You're going to hear me use the words transient infrastructure a lot today, because that's becoming more and more important to even the smaller shops. So a developer can go ahead and define the testing environment or the production environment, and as soon as that application is ready to deploy, SaltStack will go and lay that application down, whether that's on private cloud, whether that's on public cloud or hybrid cloud. You can do all your testing, automate your test cases, do whatever you need, and then as soon as you're done with it, then that infrastructure can be torn down or paused or migrated over to production infrastructure. So that's SaltStack. We kind of cover the automation and management and orchestration of cloud infrastructure.
Thank you, Matt. And yeah, let me just follow that up a little bit by talking about labs, XebiaLabs. So we build tooling that I think is very complementary and very adjacent. Obviously, it's more about the process part of things. So you've now written a great feature or a new bug fix or whatever, and you need to figure out how that actually gets into production. Where part of that obviously is you have to have all these environments, and we'll be talking quite a lot about that because it's a very common pain point. But what we do is allow you to define, execute, and improve that process of getting your code from dev complete, if you like, all the way out into production. And I think SaltStack is obviously a very common and very advanced and powerful technology that we talk to very frequently, because indeed you can't really test or evaluate or certainly run in production your applications if you don't have the virtual, transient, or permanent infrastructure to run them on. I think one thing that we're going to be talking about a little bit today is this notion of it's all very well to try to speed everything up, but you do need to be able to get a good handle on how good is the stuff that you're shipping actually. And an XL test will come into the picture there as one of the tools, our newest tool that we're seeing a lot of interest in, because people are realizing that speed is all very well, but having a successful growth or acceleration spurt of your business means speed plus quality, and the quality part is often quite a little bit more challenging than the speed part. Interesting from a technical perspective, by the way, Matt was talking about the notion of a sort of declarative approach. He'll talk about a few other things as well later, but we take a very similar approach to these kind of things. For instance, if you look at our application deployment tool, you say, how do I want the landscape of the various app components to look like? And again, you let the system figure out what needs to happen. That's just a technical point by the by. Let me just then get started and move on to the first agenda point while we have a noisy motorcycle there in the background. I think one of the things that I'm certainly seeing a lot of, and I've been to DevOps days for years and years now, and I've enjoyed it tremendously, and I've met a whole bunch of very interesting people with a number of great stories. But one of the things that I'm hearing come up quite a bit is that people are talking a lot about the kind of culture and the mindset and philosophies and empathy and ethics and all these kind of things. And I think that's obviously that's an important part of the story, but to some extent, if you actually have problems right now and you need to get something solved, then all these discussions aren't hugely useful for you, because whilst you can get a better sense of what the overall philosophy might be, it's very difficult to take that away and then go back to your day job and say, okay, well, now I know what I need to do. So to some extent, I don't want to say that these aren't useful, but I think it's enough talking about the theory and the philosophy and the mindsets and all that kind of stuff. We know from a lot of discussions that a lot of people right now, they're just at the point, they understand that they need to do something, and the big question for them is, like, what do I need to do now? Don't talk to me about group hugs, don't talk to me about philosophy, actually tell me something that I can actually get to grips with now so that I can make my life better incrementally. And obviously the messaging in this space isn't helping. If you're just approaching this right now, you can get totally confused in agile, DevOps, cloud ops, no ops, continuous delivery, agile, all this. I've said that twice, so that's kind of cheating. But there's a lot of buzzwords flying around this space right now. And to be perfectly honest, I think maybe the best and most sane advice one could give at this point is let's ignore all those buzzwords. It doesn't really matter what you want to call them. What matters is that you realize or believe that you have a goal that needs to be met. Because frankly, if you don't have a goal, if everything is going fine and there's no competitive pressure and you can do everything you need to do quickly and easily and efficiently, then obviously there's no motivation to change. But by and large, what we're seeing from most companies is that there is something that they need to change. And so it's important. The first thing, have specific measurable goals. Doing DevOps for the sake of doing DevOps is, it's dangerous and empty because you have no idea what it is that you're trying to achieve. So figure out what the goals are that you're trying to achieve. And then get moving towards addressing these goals. And don't worry too much about whether that's actually in line with one particular philosophy or another particular philosophy. Talking in terms of goals that we hear about very commonly, I guess the most obvious one, and we've mentioned it a few times already today, is we need to get our stuff out there faster. It's taking us too long. If we think of the lifetime, or how long does it take from a line of code that we're writing to get from the repo all the way to production, there's a long waiting time. We might be aggregating a whole bunch of changes together before they can go live, et cetera, et cetera. So that is something that people feel they need to improve. Obviously, doing that whilst handling an ever-growing and scaling environment, because if you're doing this well, then your company is growing. So of course, there's the challenge about doing this at scale. That's definitely a factor. But the other thing about accelerating faster, and I've touched on this already in talking about our tools, is that people are starting to realize that it's all very well to turn up the accelerator, but at some point you really need to figure out, how do I do this without putting my user experience, my customer experience at risk? How do I keep a good handle on quality and reliability, and have basically the confidence that what I'm pushing out on a more and more frequent basis isn't jeopardizing my company ultimately? And of course, the risk trade-off here is very different. You have the night capitals at one end, where making a mistake for like 45 minutes can cost you hundreds of millions of dollars. You have other companies where you can happily afford a 10 or 15-minute experiment that goes wrong and then roll it back. So there's no perfect answer here, but I think what we're seeing is that one of the really common goals is this question: we need to accelerate. We need to do that whilst being able to safeguard the quality of what we're doing. And when you take these as goals, and if they are goals that are resonating with you as you're listening to this webinar, then I think very commonly what we see is that three especially prominent pain points on the path to achieving these goals are, well, the three that I'm going to talk about now. They're obviously not the only ones. There are plenty of others we could talk about that are very interesting. But if I had to throw a blanket over our user space and over the DevOps space in general, these are probably the three most common ones that we see, and these are the ones that I would recommend. If you're trying to figure out what's on my checklist to do right now, then these would be three ones I would definitely evaluate and consider doing if you find that you have these problems. The first one is a kind of obvious one. Matt's touched on this, and we'll touch on this in much more detail in a bit. It's basically too difficult to get environments and infrastructure in the right state and having it accessible for the right people at the right time. Not just about, we need to grow our production environment because we've got lots more requests and that has to be done efficiently and quickly, but also it takes us 3 weeks to build a test environment for a particular project because nobody remembers how the environment was set up in the first place, so we're having to diff config files from old servers, etc., etc., etc. I'm sure all these stories are very familiar, and what that boils down to is that you basically have a bottleneck in terms of how much you can accelerate your feature delivery process, because if you only have 3 environments you can test in and you have more than 3 teams, chances are that one of the teams will want to test something and then they won't be able to because the test environments will be used up, or they'll be scheduled for something else, or they'll be in a period of being cleaned up or whatever. If you're doing manual or partially scripted environment configuration, very common to get into all kinds of weird states of misconfiguration. There's the classic, we tried to reuse this environment, but we discovered the previous team messed up. They installed a different version of the CLR or the .NET framework or the JVM or version of Ruby or whatever it happens to be because they needed it for their project, but then of course you can't use that environment anymore because it doesn't work for what you're trying to do. And then you're back in the inevitable, well, you're lucky once you found what the difference is, because of course most of the time it's just it doesn't work. And then you have to start to figure out, well, what are we expecting? What versions do we need of various libraries? Which permissions do which users have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of time and effort wasted in just trying to maintain these environments, get them back into a usable state. And of course, what's maybe even more dangerous is that if you don't figure this out ahead of time, if it's not a kind of misconfiguration that makes everything blow up, but maybe just something like a throttling parameter or a ulimit or something like that, that means that your system just behaves substantially differently than it would in production, then you end up trying to review all these test results and figuring out, why does the system not behave the way we expect it to, and you discover it's down to some kind of environment configuration thing. So, from my experience, these are things that I've certainly lived through them a whole bunch of times, and they are just things that you have to get rid of or have to really get under control if you're going to meet a lot of your DevOps goals. And I'll let Matt talk about how Salt can help with this a little bit later. The next big pain point that we see very commonly is getting your environments up and running, one part, but if you think about the overall process, if I got you to like map out with a bunch of post-it notes or whatever, all the steps in your process of getting your application from the moment the developers check it in and say it's ready to the moment when it's in production, then most of the time that process is certainly not optimal. Yes, for some projects you might have, a couple of mobile projects, for instance, or somebody who set up a small web project for something that was brand new and built using like the newest shiny technology, where this is basically just a commit and a couple of automated tests. But if you're in a regulated environment, or if you're talking about a slightly larger application, or one that requires training or documentation, or you're going to push out announcements, or any of these kind of real-world things that come into play, then most of the time this process is, well, first of all, in a lot of cases, people don't actually know what the entire process is. You can get them all, you can get all the people in a room and you can ask them to write it out, do this kind of post-it note exercise. And you'll find that people actually, it's a bit like the elephant analogy, people have different views of what the process actually is. They tend to know their part very well, which makes sense, but they don't really know what the full overall process actually entails. And if you don't even know that, then of course there's a big risk that you're going to miss some components or some steps totally, because it's all just existing in people's heads. And then, okay, even if you have knowledge of what the full end-to-end process is, that may only exist in some document living on some release manager's or project manager's laptop or whatever. It's very difficult for everybody else in the team to actually have a look at what's going on, and especially if you're late, there's a problem somewhere, you have like problems with the testing, or something is holding you up. It's very difficult for people to be aware of this. If you think about the difference between your software release process and, say, tracking a flight or tracking a USPS parcel or something like that, that's what a consumer experience of delivery is like in other industries, and we don't have anything like that in general for software at all. So there's very little insight, which means that the process is a bit of a black box, especially for the people who are actually paying for it. And of course, that's usually pretty frustrating, because it means that those people who are paying for it end up saying, yeah, well, I never know when anything's going to arrive. It's usually late, and it's not what I was asking for. And that's only if you think about sort of traditional server side, if you like, or in your data center type applications. But now, of course, we know mobile first. So many companies are doing that. IoT is becoming something that companies are looking at more and more. That's just going to make the overall picture even more complicated. And as a final pain point, again, just repeating what I've said a few times already. Yes, it's all very well to be able to speed this up, but then you need to figure out how you're going to make sure stuff doesn't start breaking. So the typical way to do this, which is of course a great thing and we highly recommend, is to invest in a bunch of automated testing. And that's good, because to be honest, at the kind of speed that a lot of people want to move at, automated testing is probably the only way to run your tests quickly enough for this to be feasible. But the more automated tests you have, then that becomes a problem in its own right. Automated tests, some of them at least, will tend to be a little bit flaky. They might be prone to all kinds of weird race conditions. They might be prone to subtle test data issues, environment configuration issues. And suddenly you're in a situation where every time you run your test set, there's always 5 or 6 failures or 8 failures, and sometimes there's 12. And you don't know when you're looking at this set of failures whether they're a problem or whether they're not a problem. So you actually end up spending quite a lot of time investigating and trying to flag those that are false positives and so on and so forth. And that's all very well. Then you kind of have an idea of, okay, which of these results are real and which of them are just artifacts of my test setup. But of course, you generate tests not for the purpose of having test data results. You generate them so that you can make a go no-go decision ultimately. And the more tests you have and the more different types of tests you have, the more complicated this becomes. Because really the question we typically want to ask is it good enough? And often that is related to, is it significantly worse or worse in important ways from what's currently running? And it's actually very difficult if you think of how would you go about getting the diff between your performance testing, your security testing, your functional testing, your static code analysis, the list goes on and on. How would you actually visualize that effectively, what you're currently about to push out versus what's in production? That's actually not trivial. I mean, individual tools will help you with that, but the point is that we're talking about lots of different test results coming from lots of different tools. So that's a problem that we see coming up more and more. People are realizing this. People have built some solutions around this. I'll talk about this a little bit later. But having said that, let's just briefly talk about where SaltStack and XebiaLabs come in to try to help you with these particular issues. Just a couple of diagrams to set up what Matt's going to talk about in a second, talking more specifically about SaltStack. But when we look at companies and users who are putting together the kind of joint solution, then what's happening is that SaltStack really takes away the problem of the transient and the persistent infrastructure and making that scale and making that happen. And it really, that is a big problem that people have, of course, because that's the foundation for your entire setup. If you don't have that, you don't really have much of anything. So SaltStack plays a big role in terms of managing the entire landscape and the setup. And then XL Release, that's the end-to-end process orchestration tool in which you say, okay, well, now I've got a new feature. This is what it'll take to get that out to production. And then potentially, it's not the case in every of our customers, and our tools are pretty separated, so you may use one or you may use two or all three of them. Part of that overall end-to-end process will be potentially, if you're using not a kind of full stack model, but you have a separation between your platform and your application, you might be using XL Deploy to push that application out, or you might be using XL Test as that application goes through your various transient environments to actually get an idea of what the quality is, so that once you get to the point where you can decide whether to go to production, you know what's coming up and you have reasonable confidence that it's going to work. So yeah, I mean, SaltStack in this diagram does basically all the work for the infrastructure orchestration automation, as Matt will talk about. It's very interesting in terms of not being a reactive but more of a predictive automation model. It allows you to decouple teams. It gets rid of effectively the biggest pain point that we see a lot of people struggling with. XL Release will give you the ability to map out and run that end-to-end delivery process, and XL Test, as I said, will give you the visualization and the ability to quickly make sense of lots and lots of different pieces of test data. Sometimes I call it like Splunk for test results, if you like, so that you can actually make that go-no-go decision more effectively and more quickly. From a process perspective, I mean, you probably imagined this from the diagram we had a second ago, but yeah, what you will get is Salt doing all the work to get your environments scaled, up and running, putting them in the right state, making sure they're compliant. Of course, if you're in a highly regulated setup, this takes on an additional dimension of importance, because compliance and adhering to various rules is not just a technical problem, it's actually a big business problem as well. And then once you have that environment, then XL Release would kick off something like XL Deploy potentially, or just kick off Salt. That the application code may be part of your environment definition already, and then as you're running that process, you will obviously be running tests in various parts of that, and then you want to be collecting those back together into XL Test in order to try to figure out what it is that's going on. So much for a very quick kind of overview of the problems we see and how the tool stack can start to address that. But with that, let me hand over to Matt, who's going to talk about SaltStack Enterprise for DevOps in a lot more detail.
Thanks, Andrew. As Andrew outlined, there's, when you say DevOps, it's almost like saying Agile. It's such a broad term, and it seems that every company has their own flavor of problems that they're facing. And using tools such as the XebiaLabs, XL Test, XL Deploy, and XL Release to sort of codify and make sure that you're following the same process is no different than, Henry Ford 100 years ago deciding that doing the same process a different way every time wasn't very efficient. And from an infrastructure perspective, SaltStack as a company, we service 3 distinctly different buyers. We service the DevOps crowd, which is sort of where we started, mostly because of our open source roots. We've started to service the infrastructure crowd, and then we also talk to the cloud ops, or the what I would call infrastructure architecture types as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in depth. We'll talk about those a little bit more later. But in a nutshell, infrastructure and cloud ops, or infrastructure architects, they care mainly about the infrastructure, and the DevOps crowd cares about infrastructure as a secondary metric, because they care primarily about the application and the process of getting the application out as quickly and as error-free as possible. And they have to deal with infrastructure. That's really what gave rise to the DevOps movement in the first place, was the developer community had to take over some management of infrastructure in order to develop their applications, improve them, and do those things. So what SaltStack does assuming that infrastructure is really an integral part of your application. People tend to think of them as different things, but they really aren't. If you test on a different infrastructure than you deploy into in production, your application will act differently. If you don't test on different infrastructures, then your application isn't going to be very robust. And what happens is developers then spend a whole bunch of time doing infrastructure work in order to develop their application. It's neither something they necessarily want to do, or it's really not the best use of their time, and that's really where SaltStack comes in. And as I said earlier, we're a full stack application tool which manages all the various components of what we call the cloud fabric. So when people say the word cloud, and I actually am fairly uncomfortable with that, because we say SaltStack as a company, we say, oh, we're a cloud company, we deploy to the cloud. Again, it's such an amorphous term, it's so broad. What people mean when they say cloud is they really mean solution. They're just trying to solve a problem. And so in that cloud, air quotes, infrastructure, there's a whole bunch of different components. There's applications, there's operating systems, there's virtual infrastructure, there's containers, there's code in thousands of different slices, there's different ways to lay code down, whether you want to be declarative or imperative. One, you just declare what you want the end result to be, and the system handles it. Imperative says do it in this order, in this order, in this order with dependencies. Build the web server first, then put the database, then move the database over, and then attach the web server to the database. Those kinds of things. That's really what SaltStack excels at. And as I said earlier, you use Python, and you use YAML as a simple declarative language, or you can use Jinja templating, and you simply just write a state file, what we call a state file. And the state file is a simple declaration that says, put this application down, put it in this state, put it on this infrastructure, install these things, make sure these things aren't installed, do it in this order. And off you go. And so as part of your test and deploy DevOps process through XebiaLabs, you're able to make calls out to SaltStack and stop spending the time managing infrastructure, which has been, and I'm going to say the word wasted, and I don't like using that word because time spent making sure your infrastructure is in good shape is not wasted, it's well spent. But if you can get something or someone else to do that work for you, and you can go back to the primary function of your passion, which is developing applications and solving users' needs, then you've ultimately won, because if your application is deployed to a well-tested, and if it's deployed to a comprehensive, well-designed infrastructure, and you spend zero time putting that infrastructure in place, then you're further ahead and you're able to deploy applications, A, more quickly, and B, you're able to deploy them in a more predictable manner, because you're not testing on different infrastructures every time you build. So that's really what SaltStack is it gives you the ability to tie into existing tool sets, such as the XebiaLabs tool sets, write definitions for infrastructure, whether that's definition of a test infrastructure, definition of a prod infrastructure, definition of an application, which attaches to specific infrastructures. Whatever you need, it's handled in the data in the data file or the data structure, and then simply go back to doing your job, which is writing and delivering applications as quickly as the needs of the user demand. Let's see. Let's head back one.
Let me just get you back one, Matt. I think that's where you want to be.
Yep, that's exactly where I want to be. This is just a quick look at the SaltStack Enterprise Infrastructure tool, and what we're looking at here is we're looking at targets, which are groups. So these are groups of minions or agents or machines. Targets or minions can also be network switches, storage. We have partnerships with. We've done integrations with Cisco and Broadcom and almost anything that comprises the modern day infrastructure. We have integrations with. We're integrated with all the major cloud players and a bunch of ones you've never even heard of, including this weird public cloud that only services Russian oil and gas interests and all kinds of things. That's because of our open source nature. I will say we just shipped our first GUI. We've been command line based until now, and we're putting a graphical interface on top of that in order to enable. One of the things that's very common is that the developers in infrastructures, they get very good at deploying infrastructure because, as I said earlier, they don't really necessarily like doing it. So they tend to automate it as much as possible. That's why, as a company, SaltStack is selling increasingly to infrastructure and cloud managers, because the infrastructure managers look at the DevOps guys and they say, how are you doing that so well? As it turns out, the smart guys in the company aren't just good at writing apps; they're also good at figuring out how to solve other problems, and they tend to handle it very well. And so the infrastructure and the cloud ops guys want to adopt some of the DevOps practices in normal infrastructure management. And so we, in order to enable that for a less code savvy crowd and a more infrastructure savvy crowd, we just released a new GUI. You can go out to our website and apply for our early adopter program or sign up for it. You can download it and actually give it a try. But I just wanted you to kind of take a look at it and see what it looks like. This obviously is the GUI. The command line looks exactly like the command line in every other Linux OS, so we won't show that. And then with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to Andrew, and he'll continue to talk about the process of getting your application then developed, and then handing it over to SaltStack for your infrastructure. Andrew? Did we lose you, Andrew? I think you're on mute.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I think I just had a bit of an audio glitch there.
Yeah.
I just disappeared from audio for a second. I had a nice warning telling me that my audio was bad. So let me just, without further ado, jump back into here and resume that. Yeah, I'll just briefly, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much time over these screenshots. I just wanted to talk about a few of the things that Matt also mentioned. I think we're seeing some of the same stuff. It's if you're talking to the developer or the original DevOps crowd, if you like, APIs to some extent are king, because the idea is not to look and understand, look at the problem and understand it. The idea is to get rid of it. But what typically happens, of course, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the kind of different companies that work well with our tools, is that as you start to scale this solution out from a reasonably small team or a limited scope, yeah, things come into play, different users come into play, different problems come into play, where things like oversight, insight, analytics, reporting become, unfortunately, enterprise reality and very important. So that is definitely something that we recognize in our tools as well. So this is just, I'll give you a brief idea. I mean, I talked about XR releases trying to give you that ability to define, track, and then improve the end-to-end process of getting your code out. Well, that was just a higher level pipeline view that is trying to emulate a kind of track and trace process. Here's some examples of what the process looks like in detail, and you can see there the kind of tasks Matt was talking about to actually spin up, call a minion in SaltStack, spin up an environment using Salt in order to get that stuff done before you would then continue on with your testing scenarios and so on. So that, yeah, that's what it actually looks like in practice, and of course that's, and also a mix there. You'll see a mix of automated and manual tasks. But let me not dwell on this for too long. Let me talk briefly a little bit about XL Test as well. You've heard me talk about it a few times as giving you that kind of insight into how your test's doing across a whole bunch of different underlying test tools. And really the idea here is it's like quality control in any kind of supply chain process. You really want to make sure that before you put that stuff out into production, before you expose your users to it, you have confidence that all the quality control checkboxes have been met, and probably also that you're not making stuff worse versus the previous time. So one of the things XL Test excels in is indeed in allowing you to aggregate and visualize in any way you like test results and test data coming from a whole bunch of different tools, but also looking at that in context of previous test runs. So for instance, if you want to see what the diff is between this one and say an average of the last 4 or 5 test runs, that's an interesting report you can get out. That gives you something basically about trends, and this can help you make smarter go no-go decisions. One of the other things we try to do here is, again, in recognition of the fact that the more automated tests you have, the more noise there tends to be in that overall test set, is to support some slightly more, if you like, advanced analytics along the lines of flakiness. This is a flakiness report that not only shows you a kind of pass-fail for the individual tests, but also uses that to determine how likely that test is to just flicker on and off on the basis of what may or may not be a kind of transient environment issue or something like that. So if you see a test that consistently is going on, off, on, off, on, off, it's definitely something you should investigate. That's why you can tag it with like to be investigated. But what you may want to do in your subsequent reporting is to say something like, actually, I want to filter out all the ones that are tagged as flaky or tagged as to be investigated, because they're really just distracting from my overall judgment. They're things that, that's like filtering noise out of, or outliers out of any other data set from a statistical perspective. We want to be able to do the same kind of stuff with our testing as well. So that was me briefly talking about XL Release, XL Test in this context. I'll let Matt talk a little bit about applicability to different companies. Matt, do you hear? You may be on mute, I think. I can't hear you, but maybe that's on me.
Man, I'm glad you told me about that because I was just rattling away. I said some really smart stuff too. You missed it.
Okay, here we go.
I'll try to summarize. Thanks for letting me know. I finally figured out how to mute myself. This is embarrassing, but there's a big microphone icon that looks clickable. It's not. It's a little teeny tiny microphone off to the side. Took me a second to get to it, but so the cool thing about what's that?
I was just going to say a bonus lesson on GoToWebinar for everyone.
Yep, that's right. One of the cool things about both of these tools is they're both very, very flexible. They both can be configured to support current process, and that's something that a lot of vendors sort of overlook, or they'll demand that you follow their process. And the fact is that sometimes even the worst processes you're stuck with sometimes for political or monetary or staffing reasons. And the best you can do is hope to plug them in and improve them bit by bit versus rip them all out and start all over again. And as bad as I hate to say that, that's more often true than not. We'll roll into a company and they'll say, these 12 things suck, but we can only fix this one thing right now. And both of these tools are very, very flexible. And so what you'll see is that you need to find a tool which does not demand that you plug into their process. You want a tool that allows you to bend the solution around your process while at the same time applying pressure to your process to improve that and ease the choke points, ease the pain points that Andrew talked about in the first pain point, which is you're going to identify bottlenecks in your process, and you're going to identify things you're spending time on you shouldn't. A good example of that is deploying infrastructure. If you can write a state file for the perfect infrastructure, and you do that once over a couple of hours, and then every time your XL deploy or your XL test makes that call and says this application was checked in, deploy my infrastructure, that's time you've saved every time. And so you want to make sure that the solutions are flexible enough to do that. And those needs are the ones you're going to want to address are the ones that are the most immediate and most pressing at that time. And so you want to make sure that the tools support that. And both of these do. SaltStack in particular is very, very good at addressing that. We were going to talk about our maturity model, but I'm just going to address it kind of on the fly here. I alluded to it or spoke to it earlier when I said we have three distinct buyers. We have developers or DevOps staff, we have infrastructure, and we have cloud ops or cloud architects as well fall in that group. But we also see companies fitting somewhere on the timeline. You'll see the maturity model here in a second or two. You'll see companies that are both very, very reactive. They're doing the best they can to fight fires, and they tend to fight the biggest fires first. And then you have companies who are prescriptive. They start to put tools in place. They start to use best practices. They still tend to be somewhat reactive. They tend to use automation to fight fires quicker or fight more fires at a time. And then when you get all the tools in place and when you've got all the fires automated, you become what we call predictive, and that is you're using automation, you're using metrics, you're using monitoring and an analysis to try to see problems or be aware of problems before they become true fires. And the point here is you put the tools in place and you address the biggest fire that you see, but you don't just put the fire out. You put the fire out and prevent the fire from happening again. So if every time you have to do, we see this ourselves. We just hired a bunch of new testers. The fourth day in, before he had learned SaltStack, we assigned 2 of these new testers to a task. We came back later and found that they'd spent 2 hours setting up a test infrastructure in order to run this task that we had assigned them. They hadn't really gotten trained yet. They kind of knew what we were doing, but really didn't understand it. We sat down and in half an hour showed them how to write a state file. They could then deploy that same infrastructure in literally 10 seconds of command line time, but they wound up building it into the automated test. So part of their automated test process now is as soon as they check code in, the code comes with the definition of the environment. That environment makes a call to our local, our private cloud, and it deploys a combination VMware and then a separate Docker container infrastructure to run the test. So it's done all completely automatically, and that's a good example of optimizing one specific problem, putting that fire out, and then automating that so you don't ever have to deal with that fire again. As you move over that, as you move through that continuum, what you'll find is that you get better and better and better at process, and you spend less and less time actually managing the infrastructure or managing the problem as much as you are just creating code. And you know, back to the point of this whole presentation is, when your boss hired you, or when your company hired you, or when you started your company, you never sat there. Nobody grows up and says, I can't wait to sit in a server room and manage infrastructure. Nobody does that. It's a necessary part of our jobs. What we all like to do is we like to create solutions which delight users. That's what we like. And anybody in our audience who's created an app or even written a script, you know, I wrote a script one time when I managed a big data center for EMC, north of 20,000 nodes, and at the time was giant. And I wrote this little script. It was the stupidest little script in the world. It was a little database cleanup script. And what it did is it optimized the database to perform a little quicker. And I put it on a cron so that it would just run repeatedly. And I heard users for the next 2 weeks were like, oh my gosh, it's so much quicker and the application's so much better. And that was delightful. And that's what developers do, is they delight users by creating innovative solutions and not spending their time thrashing the infrastructure. So that's the point, is you want to be able to take these tools, put your fires out, automate the fire so that you improve in that area, and then find the next fire to fight, automate that one, till you get to where all you're spending your time doing is creating and deploying wonderful applications and making people happy, and not beating your head against the wall trying to keep the infrastructure in state. This is just a kind of a quick look at our maturity model, kind of where some of the tools sit on the scale. I think everybody kind of gets it. It's fairly obvious, so I won't belabor that point anymore. And then the last thing I was going to have you look at is, I'm going to skip this, but I'm going to skip to one of our customer use cases. And this is really good because this is a giant company. Their infrastructure is really, really big. They're 50,000 nodes plus. But they're also really, really innovative. And what you'll find is that even in very large companies, it's interesting. You'll have a small company, and a small company really just is a small company. Then you have a medium-sized company, and they have a different problem set, but they also have the same problems as a small company. But they have those problems plus new ones. And then you get big companies like LinkedIn. They don't have just big company problems. They have small, medium, and large-sized company problems. And that's why it's important to be able to react differently in different situations. LinkedIn has a massive infrastructure. This slide's out of date. They're actually crossed 50,000 nodes. They're probably going to be 70,000 nodes by the end of the quarter. They use SaltStack because it's very, very fast. It's very, very scalable. But they have tons of these little small development teams internally. These teams can be as small as 2 people. They generally are 5 people to sometimes 15 people. And they do lots and lots of automated deployment and testing. And that's why they use SaltStack, because these small teams are able to come in. They are able to define the infrastructure as part of their application and DevOps creation and deployment process, and they don't spend a whole lot of time managing the infrastructure. They spend time automating the applications, and that's why in a sea of what I would call business-based social networking sites, LinkedIn has really pulled away from the crowd because they update quickly, they're innovative, and they don't spend a bunch of time doing things that aren't the core competency of their job. They spend time improving their application and improving the user experience, and that showed in what they own in their market space. And it's just a really, really great example of someone who's taken a strong DevOps process, spent time doing actual development and not just managing infrastructure, and actually improved the lives of their users and garnered a bunch of company share. So that kind of summarizes it for me. Andrew, is there anything else you wanted to say there?
Well, not on this one, but I wanted to pick you up if I just move on to a couple of, well, just similar kind of stories for us. I think, well, first of all, thanks for that. I think very interesting insights there. I think one of the key ones that Matt just mentioned is the fact that, you don't just have problems specific to your size. You tend to have problems representing your entire growth phase. So a large company will have small company problems too. But we know from the market that there are a ton of solutions out there that are very good at small company problems and that are absolutely not good at all when it comes to medium or large company problems. And similarly, the other way around, there are plenty of tools that are good at large company problems and that are not very good at all at small company problems. And I mean, the challenge here is, Matt was talking earlier about not trying to optimize, obviously putting out the fires that you have now. In other words, looking for solutions that address your current pain points. But the point is that over time, especially if you're successful, and I guess that's what we all want to be, your company will grow and evolve, and you will get into these other classes of problems. And the point is, it's very painful if you realize at a certain point that all the solutions you put in place do not really handle the new class of problems that you have very well. And then you're faced with two very uncomfortable alternatives. One is to try to stretch your existing solutions and basically push them till they fall over, which eventually they definitely do. Or you have to go through some enormous migration process to abandon, if you like, all the solutions that you had for your past life, and then retool everything, which especially if, as Matt says, you're trying to focus on serving your users, which when you're growing is the last thing you want is to have to invest time in like retooling everything. It's super painful. So it's important to bear in mind at least that there are some solutions out there, and I think from what Matt was showing, and I think XebiaLabs falls in the same category, it's interesting to see that we have very interesting customer use cases that are at totally different ends of the spectrum of complexity and of problem scale. And of course, different sizes of company get different value out of the tools. And, for some of them, some features and some goals are totally more interesting than others. But it's important to know that I think these tools can grow with you as well. So just briefly, we have one example. This is an Alexa release customer in this particular case. What's important for them is that the system was really easy to get up and running, so they didn't have to figure out Java plugin development and all that kind of stuff. And they could basically get everybody it's a small team, but they wanted everybody involved. And it's simple enough to use. You don't have to be a super tech-savvy guru to make sense of some API or something like that. For them, it was all about getting everyone on the same page and moving fast. Things are changing all the time in their organization. They're basically tuning and reinventing their processes as they go along. So the last thing they want is something that's fairly rigid and that constrains them in terms of what they're able to do. So that was very important for them. And if you look at, go to the other end of the spectrum, for one of our very, very large Fortune 500 enterprises who are running thousands and thousands of delivery pipelines or release processes through these a month, it's a very different story, right? For them, yes, flexibility, ease of use is important, but it's also important to be able to enforce some kind of standards, to get some kind of regularity in there, and much more importantly, get data out, whether that's test data, quality data, or data about the process itself. Because they're very much in this, data-driven improvement. They've got so many things going on at the time that they can't just have a quick meeting with 10 people, figure out, yeah, we know what our biggest pain points are, let's go fix those. They really need to apply some kind of analysis to figure out where do we invest our next, $500,000, $1 million, whatever, to try to improve pieces, and that's where data becomes absolutely critical. So, maybe the one takeaway from this one is, think about tooling that gives you access to the data, because ultimately that data is king. Right, having said that, let me hand it over to Matt for the last few slides. I know we're going to go through this quickly because we want to get some questions in.
Thanks. So basically what you want to do is, and I think we've probably covered these already, and so we're just going to kind of whip through these, but really in a nutshell, it really is identifying the process, finding a tool, automating that process, putting out the pain points, and then getting through your job. So the less time you spend doing something other than your core job, the more time you have to spend doing your job. And I think at the end of the day, that's kind of what I would say. From a Salt perspective, we have tons and tons of stuff you can go look at. You can go look at a lot of our SaltConf 2015 videos. We've posted some of the content, about half of the content that was at the show is there. If you want to see the full content, we welcome you back to Salt Lake next spring. We also, like I said, you can actually go register right now for our early adopter program. The first cut of our GUI just hit the streets about a week ago. We have another release coming here in about 2 weeks, and we're going to iterate pretty quickly as we build the graphical interface on top of the core functionality. And then we have tons of white papers. So from a Salt perspective, that's where I would point you, Andrew.
I think if we go to the next slide briefly, we've got obviously the links to the company website. So let's go on back just to show the links here. So you can of course follow us, much the same as what Matt was saying. You can download and give all our tools a try. We're especially interested, of course, if you're interested in trying to hook the two up together. very obviously interested in helping with that and learning about how you're planning to use them together and what kind of benefit or what kind of goals you have that you're trying to, what kind of fires you have that you're trying to put out with this. Yeah, there's plenty of, we try to obviously share as much knowledge about the space as we can through blogs, white papers, and so on. But yeah, let me, I could go on about this for a long time, but in the interest of time, let me now just jump to a couple of questions. Hopefully we can get a few of those out before we wrap up.
Great, great. Andrew and Matt, thank you very much. I'm just going to jump right to questions. We have a number of things that have come in. One question was that you mentioned that these tools are applicable to a number of different size organizations. Is there a particular sweet spot, either to the kind of organization or the size of it, or where do you see these tools best fitting?
You want to go first?
Yeah, I'll take that. I'll take that first. We kind of hit this as we went through, and that is that both of these tools actually can start very, very small. We have a small company of 2 guys who write this little gaming app, and they use SaltStack and they love it. And then of course we've got LinkedIn and Hulu and Netflix and some very, very big companies. So from an infrastructure perspective, because it's very easy to define the data structures and it's easy to manage via Python, our sweet spot really kind of is in the smaller DevOps shop and then up through the infrastructure IT. But really we cover anywhere on the spectrum. It's as much or as little of the tool as you like to consume.
Yeah, and I mean, I think from our perspective, I think that the one thing to point out, this sweet spot company, I think if you find that if you look at those customers who really come back and say, wow, well, this is something really unique that we really have tried to do and are not able to do, there is, I would say, a base level of complexity of your current state. I mean, I think if you're a development team of 2 people with a simple application that you deploy where your processes hit a button and you don't have any QA environments or anything like that, you just deploy straight to production after your unit tests. Of course, our tools will work for you, so that they'll be very easy and simple to use. Whether you'll see the enormous difference between those tools and one of the 5 trillion other alternatives that will be out there, I think that's a legitimate question. I think what we definitely see is that our tools start to very much come into their own once you start moving beyond the one team, one technology, one environment. Complexity can be measured in many different dimensions in this space, but as soon as you start getting into anything that's just about non-trivial, you start to run into a lot of the problems that our tools tend to be pretty good at helping you solve. So that's what I would say, yeah.
As you expand the scope, the complexity increases as you automate things. That brings new challenges, etc. So sounds like a great fit for your products. I think this may be directed more towards Matt. SaltStack is often compared to things like Puppet and Chef. One of our questions came in is, how is it different than Ansible? Did you talk a little bit about what it's different, why it's different?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question, and we get that all the time. And really what that is that's a comparison to some competitors we have in one specific space. So Puppet, Chef, and Ansible are really, really great tools. I would honestly evaluate all of them if I were looking at doing straight configuration management, infrastructure configuration, or DevOps deployment and configuration. The advantage that SaltStack has with those competitors is SaltStack also does true orchestration. And the difference, those words are often used interchangeably, but there's a subtle difference. Infrastructure management or config management is simply dictating or applying config changes to an infrastructure. Orchestration is the ability to do things in different parts of the infrastructure in a specific order or based on built dependencies. So you can, say deploy the web server first and then deploy a database server and then copy the database server from here to there. And because Salt has an abstraction layer at the minion, for example, a good example of this is Puppet. We had a customer, his name is Ryan Lane, works for Lyft. He wrote a blog about migrating from Puppet to SaltStack, and he was able to reduce a 10,000-line Puppet manifest down to 1,000 lines of code in Salt because we're abstracted that layer. But that orchestration engine is really where we're different. Is we're able to truly orchestrate to the point where we have many, many clients who started out with Puppet or Chef. We're not able to do full orchestration as you approach more complex builds, and they use Salt to actually orchestrate Puppet, Chef, and Ansible. And so it's very common, and that's where we're different. With Ansible, it's a little different. Ansible is agentless. We also can run agentless as well. But when you're completely agentless and you don't have the ability to have a minion, you run into a limitation of scale that pretty fast. So I would say orchestration is the main difference between other vendors who are in the config space and SaltStack, who covers config but also does full orchestration.
Okay, very good.
Good question.
Very good. Let's see if we can move to sort of a lightning round format and see if we can get as many questions in as we can. Andrew, you talked about the visualization and how that can help with test results. Is that because it will show you new insights or give you a more comprehensive analysis? What are the benefits of that visualization?
Oh God! And a lightning round. Oh God, this is difficult. Let me try to bring you at different ends of the spectrum. If you're a tester, or if you're in a modern kind of embedded, if you like, a developer, so like we're not having testing as a separate discipline. The big benefit is that a lot of time is spent trying. It failed. Why did it fail? How often has it failed in the past? How do blah blah blah? All these kind of questions that you can burn a lot of time. Basically, you need to be able to get a good overview of all the stuff that's happening. It's like a control panel, so you can drill down. You can say, oh no, this one we know about it. This is like a bad kid. We haven't fixed it yet. Let's ignore it for now. So that's at the kind of low level where just being able to see all your test stuff across different tools. I mean, you might have 8 or 9 different tools in your environment, all of which are spewing out test results. Of course, you can go to 8 or 9 different UIs and do the comparisons in each one and hope that the visualization capabilities of whatever plugin you're using for that tool provide what you need. But that's not a very fun way. That's the same problem we had with trying to make sense of logs on 12 different servers. That's why we had a whole generation of log aggregation and APM tools that made sense of all this data in one place, because that's when it made sense. That's at the technical level. Maybe briefly at the business level. At that level, what matters is not so much what is this individual test doing, because frankly, tests are just a proxy for confidence and quality. What really matters is, can we hit the button on this one or not? And you want to, of course, you want to be able to have a traffic light kind of. It's green, good, we can go. But most people are a little bit curious and want to know why the traffic light is green. So you do want to be able to show, okay, well, we thought it's green because we passed 97% of our tests across all the different types. Plus, we are only 8% worse on performance in this area of the system, something along those lines. So that is data you want to visualize, of course. And you can do it. You can do it in PowerPoint, and you can export stuff and screenshot things out of Jenkins, and you can build your own visualization UI for what we've done. But that's not a lot of fun. As Matt said, you should be spending time building cool apps, not building all the auxiliary tools around it.
Certainly not tasks that developers want to be spending their time creating PowerPoints and Excel spreadsheets, so I can see there'd be huge benefits there too. This question may be directed to Matt. Are you able to create virtual services for dev prototyping and production like load testing? They referenced comparing it to CA's Lisa or IBM's Green Hat. That may be about what you mentioned of spinning up a virtual image with Docker in it. I'm not sure. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, and in the interest of time, I will say, yeah, we absolutely can do that. We have many developers who spin up sort of, we call it it's an encapsulated app, and that really, you could use a container, but that's not the way we always do it. Sometimes we just do straight installs, but yeah, absolutely we can do that.
Okay, great. One question was, how or why do commercial tools, the things that both your companies are offering, how do they complement some of the open source options that are available? Typically, DevOps folks think of, oh, it's got to be an open source tool, but there's a lot of things that commercial tools bring to the table. What might that be? Andrew, do you want to jump in?
How much time do we have? Matt, do you want to go first?
I will take this, and I'll try to keep it short, but it's going to be hard to. But in a nutshell, Salt is an open source product. And so what we've done is we've taken the open source, and we remain committed to the open source. So every new piece of functionality we put in via a module goes back into our open source. If you need the additional visibility of a GUI on top of that, you can go ahead and purchase that and pay for the things, but you'll never be limited. And I think from a perspective of the both of us, at some point a company matures to the point where they have less time than money, and it makes more sense to have Henry Ford build the car for you and buy it than it does for you to build it yourself. And when you're a small shop and maybe you have more time than money, you can cobble some of these stuff together in the open source. But when you have companies like us who give you both options, or you're able to use open source till you're ready to pay for it, you really do get the best of both worlds there. And so I think that's an important distinction. But there always comes a time in every company's history where they say, hey, I love open source, but at the end of the day, I don't have time to keep committing to this. I need someone to track it and manage it and pull indemnification for it and that kind of thing. So that's a great question.
Great. I know we're out of time, but if I can just say something, obviously I would second everything Matt said, but I think one important thing to bear in mind is when people say we favor open source, that means many different things. There's an angle of cost, there's an angle of just belief, like it's almost a religious thing to some extent, and then there is an angle of accessibility, like open source tools tend to be easy to download and so on. And I think, the cost one is very legitimate. We have free editions that you can use, so definitely if you're not using complicated functionality, we don't believe you should be paying for it. We think that's just fair. The kind of accessibility angle, well, same kind of thing. Of course, you have to be able to get at the tool, and it's not just the code itself. It's more the guidance around it and the kind of community around it, which we try to foster as well. The third angle, I think we have to learn to let go of a bit. It's taking a particular type of tool just because it's you should choose a tool that solves your problem well, and I think Matt said it perfectly. It's at some point, just because a tool is free, which is often where the motivation comes from, doesn't mean it's the best choice. Because all these companies that give away free tools, they have to pay their employees as well. It's not as though they're running out of a charity or something. So there has to, and they are delivering value. So I think, if you're a DevOps consultant somewhere, you are writing big invoices for the services you deliver, and justifiably so. So I think, if tooling can help make the situation better at that place, and your time would have to be spent to get it to work. I think it's just a reasonable and rational cost-benefit analysis to say it just looks better if I pay a little bit of money to these people than if I have to hire someone to build something that I could already get off the shelf.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's often more time involved in putting things together. But well, great. Thank you, gentlemen. I think we're at the end of our time. On behalf of our audience, I would like to thank both Matt Meservey and Andrew Phillips, Matt from SaltStack and Andrew from XebiaLabs, for a lot of information. You guys covered a lot of territory today, and I think it was really rich with information. So thank you to you both. I also like to thank our audience for joining us, and the recording of the webinar as well as the slides will be a follow-up available after the webinar. So on behalf of DevOps.com, this is Mitchell Ashley, thanking you for joining the webinar, and we'll be talking with you soon as we all continue down the adventures of pursuing DevOps. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.